And we're going to jump right in this morning in Matthew 14. Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, if you want to turn there. The context, just very briefly, is Jesus has just learned about John the Baptist's death. And so he's come to the conclusion that he's going to go away and be by himself for a little bit. And so Jesus goes with his disciples away to the other side of the lake to have some quiet time, to grieve his friend, to recharge, to prepare for what will become his own death in a matter of just a few months. And so Jesus has gone to be by himself, and we pick up reading Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 13. It says, when Jesus heard about it, that would be John the Baptist's death, he withdrew from there by boat to a remote place to be alone. When the crowds heard this, they followed him on foot from the towns. As he stepped ashore, he saw a huge crowd, felt compassion for them, and healed their sick. When evening came, the disciples approached him and said, "This place is a wilderness, and it is already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves." "They don't need to go away," Jesus told them. "You give them something to eat." "But we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish here," they said. "Bring them to me," he said. Then he commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Looking up to heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. Everyone ate and was filled. Then they picked up 12 basketfuls of leftover pieces. Now those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. I'll give you a quick story, and we'll come back to the text. It is the spring of 2014, and I have been voluntold that I'm in charge of the retreat at Round Lake. If you've never been voluntold, that's when someone else tells you that you volunteered, okay? The gentleman who had led the high school retreat at Round Lake had moved out of state around Christmas time, and when the schedule for spring retreats came out, my name was on the schedule to lead the high school retreat. And I called the camp and said, I didn't sign up for this. "Sure you did. You'll do a great job." Now, I had been involved with the high school retreat 6 or 7 years earlier, and the last time I had led the high school retreat, there had been about 60 or so students that had been there for the weekend. And so I was kind of in my mind thinking, we'll prepare for that. In fact, the day before the retreat, Thursday, when I ran all of my schedules and all of my rooming assignments, I had 53 students registered for the weekend retreat, and I thought, okay, right about 60, we're good. In fact, I've done this enough that I always plan for a little bit extra. So I remember thinking, we're going to plan for 75. We're going to have enough snacks for 75 kids. We're going to have enough faculty to take care of 75 kids. We're going to have enough classes for 75 kids. We're going to plan for 75. That's 22 students registering at the last minute. That's a pretty nice buffer. We had 128 students that weekend. I had 75 kids walk in the 30 minutes before the retreat started and register the day of. I did not have enough snacks for 125 kids. I didn't have enough adults for 125 kids. I didn't have enough schedules I didn't have enough anything for 125 kids. We simply did not have enough to take care of who showed up. So for about 10 minutes, I freaked out and yelled at people. And then I composed myself and realized that crying in the corner of the dean's quarters probably wasn't going to solve any problems. And we began to act. I have the blessing at that point of having led about 15 years worth of camp, having a dynamite faculty around me. And so we just kind of went into action. And, hey, can you run to Walmart and pick some of this? And I need you to call somebody back at the church to run more copies and bring them down. And, hey, can you call these 3 people and see if they'd come spend the weekend? I know they weren't planning on hanging out with high school kids all weekend, but I need 3 more adults. Call them and see if they'll come anyway. And we just began. And by 8 o'clock the next morning, through very practical, we had some pizza delivered from Domino's for dinner. We raided the freezer on the other side of camp. We just made it work. Very practical, logical. We have a problem. This is how we're going to have enough. We're going to make it work. And I was thinking about that story because I think, as I read the story of the feeding of the 5,000, I think I'd have been like one of the disciples. They notice the problem, and they don't even wait till it's a problem. Like, they are forward thinking. They see this crowd of thousands of people. Now, Matthew ends by saying there are 5,000 men plus women and children, which means we're probably looking at 15 to 20,000. It's the city of Dover, okay? The city of Dover has shown up to listen to Jesus preach. And they're watching And as dinner time approaches, it dawns on them, listen, if we don't feed these people, we're going to have a problem. Because a crowd of followers can turn into an angry mob if they're not fed very, very quickly. Anyone who ever taught preschool knows how that works, right? Okay, if you don't feed them, they can turn into monsters. And so the disciples are very pragmatic here. Jesus, we've got a problem. They're going to, in just a little bit, these guys are going to be really hungry, and we have no food. And there's Domino's doesn't deliver out here, and Walmart's closed. We need to do something. And so they come up with what they think is the best, most logical solution. Let's send them into the villages. And there probably won't be enough food for everybody to be full, but at least everybody can have something. We send 1,000 over there and 1,000 over there and 500. Send them down by the sea where they can fit. At least there'll be something there. But we have no hope of feeding them. And so they come to Jesus with not just the problem, but a very practical solution to the problem. And Jesus just isn't having it. In fact, it's one of those interesting things that you miss. There are times I wish I could just teach you all to read Greek. Anybody want to take Greek classes? No? No hands? No? Okay. You're bad. You're lost. There are times where we just miss something in the translation, and this is one of those times. Verse 16, verse 17, and verse 18 all begin with the exact same word in the Greek language. And it's only two letters. It's delta epsilon, and it is a word that is almost always translated but. It's this negative conjunction defined to say, you say this, but I say this. In fact, the passage most closely remembers Jesus on the Sermon on the Mount, just a few chapters earlier, when he says things like, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, turn the other cheek. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery, but I say to you, if you love lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery in your own heart. Where Jesus says, this is what you see, this is what you think, but let me show you another way. And so this passage is back and forth between Jesus and the disciples. They come in verse 15 and they say, this place is a wilderness and it is already late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy food for themselves. And 16 begins, but they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. Can you imagine? I mean, what's the biggest church dinner we've ever fed here? We've fed a couple hundred people at the Valentine's dinner, maybe some church picnics back in the day with 300 people around. Can you imagine how much food it takes to feed 15,000 folks? Can you imagine? They've got bread, and can you imagine how many filet of fishes it takes to feed 15,000 people? I mean, this is just absurd. And that must be exactly what the disciples thought. Us give him something to eat? Jesus, what are you talking about here? Have you seen the size of the crowd? That guy over there he's like Josh's size. He could eat 4 pizzas. How are we going to even feed him, much less everybody else? Don't laugh. It's true. I can't eat 4 pizzas. No piling on now. I heard you over there. No problem. And so the disciples respond with a but of their own. Jesus says, but they don't need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they say, but we only have 5 loaves and 2 fishes here. And Jesus responds again, but bring them to me. And the reason it's important that we capture that negative conjunction, that but, that back and forth, is because you need to understand that there are 2 distinct worldviews being presented here. On the one hand, we have the disciples' view of the situation. And the disciples' view of the situation is we have this incredible need, this incredible problem, and we cannot take care of it. There simply is not enough. When I didn't have enough pizza at a week of camp, I called Domino's and they brought it to me. When I'm in the middle of the wilderness and there are 15,000 people, nobody delivers out there. There is no McDonald's to run to and buy more sandwiches. And even if there was, who here has enough money to buy pizza for 15,000 people? That's a lot of food. And so all they can see is the problem. All they can see is the lack of resources. All they can see is this bad situation. And the only thing they can think of is send the people away. And on the other hand, we have Jesus saying, but don't you see my perspective? Don't you see that when I'm here, there's always enough? Don't you see that when I'm around, we can overcome any problem? Don't you see that when I'm with you, there are always enough resources? I am always all that you need. And so they go back and forth. Jesus, send them away so they can eat. But you give them something to eat. But Jesus, we don't have anything. Bring me what you have. And watch what I can do. And so he sends them out with the bread, and they begin to feed this massive crowd of people. And I always wonder, do you think the average guy sitting in the crowd had any clue what was going on? I mean, if you're like the 15,002nd guy sitting all the way in the back row, all you know is that this disciple comes by and hands you a loaf of bread and a fish out of a basket. And then he goes to the next guy and hands some bread and some fish to the next guy. Like, do you have any concept of what's actually taking place? I mean, certainly anyone who can produce enough food in the wilderness to feed a large crowd is doing something special. But I'm pretty certain that they had no clue of the logistics of what was taking place, only that they were being fed by someone who was doing something by the power of God. But those disciples, with every single loaf they passed out, their wonder must have grown. With every single fish they handed to a hungry child, their awe at the God they served must have magnified. And they must have thought, at some point this has to run out. At some point this has to run out. And they kept handing it out. Can you imagine how long it takes 12 guys to pass out that much food? Just the logistics of serving 1,000 people a disciple is nuts. And with every single one, they must have thought, wow, I don't know what Jesus is doing here, but this is remarkable. And in some ways, the story looks backwards to the Old Testament. It's kind of reminiscent of the story of Elijah and the widow. You remember? When there's the jar of oil and the jar of flour, and they keep going back and they bring out the flour and they bring out the oil and they make a loaf of bread and they go back the next day and there's more. It's kind of reminiscent of that. That as they pass out the food, they look in the basket and there's more food left. It's also kind of reminiscent of Moses in the wilderness, right? Jesus led the crowd out into the wilderness to teach them, just like Moses led them out into the wilderness for their freedom. And they have nothing to eat, and then suddenly, through this miraculous provision of God, they have what they need. In the wilderness, it was manna. Here, there's fish and bread for everyone to have enough. There's one distinct difference, though. In the wilderness, when the manna fell, there was only ever just enough. Right? If you gathered up extra and you took it to store in your house, it went rotten the next day. You had what you needed, you had your provisions for today, but never any more than you needed. You had just enough. When Jesus is done, there are 12 basketfuls of bread left over. One basket for every unbelieving disciple to carry. With Jesus, there is more than enough. And so in some ways, this story looks backwards to all those times God had miraculously provided for his people. And here he is once again saying, listen, through Jesus, when Jesus is with you, you will always have enough to cope with what you need. In other ways, it looks forward. Verse 19, as we read, says this, then Jesus commanded the crowds to sit down on the grass. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Looking up to heaven, he blessed them. He broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. Excuse me. There are 4 verbs in that sentence that happen back to back to back to back. Jesus takes the bread. He blesses the bread, or gives thanks for the bread. He breaks the bread, and then he gives the bread to his disciples. It's all one long clause. He takes, he blesses, he breaks, and he gives. Do you know that in Matthew chapter 26, those same 4 verbs appear back to back to back to back again? It sounds like this. This is Matthew 26:26. And as they were eating, Jesus took the bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, take and eat. This is my body. In fact, every single account we have of the Last Supper in the Gospels and Paul's retelling takes those same 4 Greek verbs and lines them up in the exact same order. Jesus takes the bread, he blesses the bread, he breaks the bread, and he gives the bread. Now, I don't think Matthew is trying to argue that the feeding of the 5,000 is some sort of communion service where fish takes the place of the fruit of the vine. That would just be weird. Can you imagine if we served fish and bread instead of juice and bread for communion? The service would smell different. But I do think Matthew, as an author, wants us as the reader to see the connection. And to note that that day in the countryside in the wilderness, when Jesus was enough to meet their physical needs, also points to that day on the cross when Jesus would be enough to meet our spiritual needs. That day in the wilderness when he filled the hunger of their stomachs, he would also one day be enough to fill the cravings of our heart. That day when he was able to satisfy their physical nature for just a few more hours, he would one day be able to satisfy the longings of our soul for all of eternity. That Jesus is not just enough to fill our empty bellies, he's enough to fill our empty lives too. Jesus is always more than enough. And I think that's so important. I was thinking about this in terms of, Eric's our lone graduate today. And one of those things that happens at graduation as you begin this journey into adulthood is you have to decide where you're going to look for your joy and meaning in life. You see, until you're 18, you just go and do what you're told, right? You're going to go to school. You're supposed to. I know that some of you don't do what you're told, but you're supposed to go and do what you're told. You're going to go to school for this many hours, and your parents are going to make you do this, and they're going to eat what they put in front of you, and you have very little control. And as you move into adulthood, which some of you have not done, never mind. I use that word adulthood loosely for myself and some of you as well. You begin to decide what your life is going to be about. You can eat what you want to eat. You can get the job you want to get. You can spend your free time how you want to spend it. You can buy the car you want to buy. You can live in the house you want to live in. And as we make those choices, we become very aware that we live in a world that promises happiness and satisfaction in a lot of different ways. Like the number one marketing campaign is, if you just buy our product, you'll be happier, right? It doesn't matter if it's a car or a house or a vacation home or toothpaste, right? If you buy our tooth whitening toothpaste, you'll smile prettier and people like you and you'll be happier. We sell happiness in a tube. Eat our cheeseburger and you'll be happier. Trust me, I've tried. It doesn't work. I have tried and never mind. A lot of fat jokes today. And so we live in this world that presents this message. You can find happiness in material possessions. You can find happiness in the acceptance and love of other people. If you just find the right friend, if you just find the right spouse, if you just find the right group of people to hang out with, if you just find the right church, if you just find then you'll be happy. As if another human being could ever fix what's wrong inside of us. Could fix that brokenness. If you just make enough money, if you just get enough promotions, if you just take enough vacations, you'll have peace and joy, as if a week at the beach could fix what's going on in here. And so we're told these lies, and we think in the back of our mind, well, nobody really believes that. Nobody really, I don't actually chase those things. You know how susceptible we are to suggestion? When we play one song and put the other words on the screen, we start singing those words even though everybody in the room knows those words don't go with that music. We're like, well, we can sing the words to this song to that tune. I was just sitting there thinking, what an analogy for what we do with our lives. Well, we can take this Jesus stuff and make it fit the tune of the world. We can dress up all of this Christianity and just kind of live our lives according to the beats and rhythms of culture, having the big house and the big boat and the big car and the success and the popularity and all that everybody else says we should have, and we'll just dress it up and we'll put the Christian words with all of the melodies of the world. Of course we do. And what we find, if we chase those dreams long enough, is that they never satisfy. I'll tell one more fat joke and then I'll be done. There was this place in Canton back in probably like 2002, 2003, when I was still playing football at Malone, and it was called Piazzo's Pizza. And it was kind of like CC's Pizza before CC's Pizza was a thing. It was an all-you-can-eat pizza buffet, but we use the word pizza loosely when talking about it. Okay, that's what they called it. In particular, it was this incredibly super thin crust that you almost couldn't taste. It was like they put toppings on air almost. And it was the kind of pizza that you could just eat and it never really filled you up. If you've ever had that kind of food that you could, kind of like chips and salsa at the Mexican place. You've eaten like 3 bowls of chips and don't realize it. And so we used to go there on Friday nights before home football games, the offensive line from Malone University. We got our money's worth, we'll just say that. And you could always tell the difference between the guys who had to get up and play at 11 o'clock the next morning and the freshmen who knew they didn't have to play. Because if you know you got to get up and play at 11 o'clock the next morning, you have to I'll have like 7 or 8 pieces and then I'm done because I don't want to be sick tomorrow when I have to start running around in the heat. The freshmen who knew they were going to stand on the sidelines all day, though, I remember watching this one kid, his name was Evan, and I watched Evan put down 49 pieces of pizza. And if we hadn't said it's time to leave, I think he would have kept eating. And I think that's what the things of this world are. They are, if you're looking for peace and financial security, and there's nothing wrong with being financially secure, that's not what I'm saying, but if you think that's going to fix the brokenness of your heart, the longings of your soul, you can chase that as far as you want to chase it, and your bank account can get as big as you want it to get, and you can have the nicest house you want to have, and the nicest car you want to have, and the fanciest toys you want to have, and it will never be enough. You'll always go back for more. And if you think that like the acceptance and love of other people is going to somehow satisfy your soul, you can chase that as far down the road as you want to go. You can get 1,000 friends on Facebook. Okay? You can have you can hang out with, you can chase, and I'm gonna be with this guy, and when he doesn't make me any happier, I'll be with this guy, and when he doesn't make me happy, I'll be with this guy, and if he doesn't make me happy, I'll be. You can do that. You can have as many kids as you want to have, and I just need one more kid, and then your family will be complete. You can change your identity so people like you better. You can hop from one church to the other trying to find you can do all that. And it's like eating at that pizza buffet. No matter how much you put in, it will never actually be enough. And the promise of Christ, both at the feeding of the 5,000 and through his death and resurrection on the cross, is this. When you are with Jesus, you always have enough. In fact, you have more than enough. In a couple of weeks, actually next Sunday, I guess, I leave for high school camp. And I'll be teaching, I have 12 messages in 5 days. And so I've been working a lot on these messages for camp. Some of them are short, 5-6 minutes. Some of them are full-fledged sermons. And little campfire things. And it dawned on me that this is kind of weird for me. Because I spent so long in youth ministry that I knew the kids when I went to talk to them. And so I still kind of vaguely know, we're going to have 140 high school kids, give or take a little bit there. And so I know things like, there are going to be a whole bunch of them struggling with pornography, so we're going to talk about that. And there are going to be a whole bunch of them struggling with their relationship with their parents, and so we're going to talk about that. There's going to be a whole bunch of them struggling with alcohol and drug abuse, so we're going to talk about. So I have these vague generalities, but it dawned on me this week, I don't know them like I know you. And I know you guys. And I know in this room there are people dealing with loneliness and grief because they have lost someone that was their best friend. If you're in that spot, I just want to say to you, Jesus is enough. If you feel overwhelmed by grief, if you have those days where you feel dark and depressed and all alone, if you feel like, how can I possibly go on? I just want to encourage you, Jesus is enough. Cling to him. Seek him out. Find him. He is enough. And I know there are people in this room dealing with fear, whether it is fear of finances and how we're going to pay bills. It is fear of what am I going to do when that diagnosis comes in? Fear of what am I going to do when cancer finally takes this person? And I just want to say to you, Jesus is enough. He is your hope. He is your strength. He is your comfort. Cling to him. I know there are people in this room consumed with bitterness, consumed with just this anger at how life has dealt them a bad set of hands. Maybe it's anger at a person, maybe it's anger at a situation, maybe you're just angry because you're angry all the time. And I just want you to know, if you would just let go of that, Jesus offers this peace that passes understanding, and he is more than enough to fix your heart. I know there is hurt in this room because I've walked through some of it with you. I know what it is to be stressed. I know what it is to grieve. I know where some of you sit, and I just want to say to all of you, Jesus is enough, more than enough. And nothing else can do for your heart and soul what he can. And so we're going to finish with this prayer time. I'm going to play a song for you, ironically titled Enough. And the chorus of the song says simply this: all of you is more than enough for all of me. For every thirst and every need, all of you is more than enough for all of me. And I'm going to sit down here in the front row and I'm going to pray for you. But I would love to pray with you too. And I've mentioned this before. I know for some of you this whole idea of coming down and talking to Josh is weird because what are people going to think and what are they going to... People aren't going to think anything. And I just want to tell you that if you're in a spot where you are struggling with grief or with fear or with sin or you're overwhelmed by stress and you don't know where you turn, I just want to pray with you. So I'm going to sit here and as the song plays, I'm going to pray for you. But I'd love to invite you to come sit next to me and we'll pray together as well. So let me pray. We'll play the song, and you come if you'd like to.